Danger at Diablo, Chapter 4. Twin Troublemakers. Annie had been right about that small puff of smoke she thought she saw coming up from among the big rocks that bordered the road ahead. It had drifted up from a cooking fire that was burning briskly under a battered frying pan. A rough-looking man was hunkered down over the fire, stirring a greasy, scorched mixture of bacon and beans in the pan. A second man lay snoring a few feet away, rolled in a blanket. 2 horses stood in the early morning shade of the big rocks and munched on dried tufts of grass. Their saddles lay close by in an untidy heap. The man at the fire turned a dirty, black-bearded face to snarl at the sleeper. Come on, roll out. It's past sunup." The second man yawned widely and sat up. It was like looking at 2 copies of the same picture, to see a bearded face just as black and dirty as the first, and with the same beady black eyes and weak-lipped mouth. There was no mistaking that these 2 were not only brothers, but twins. The second man scratched his ribs sleepily, ran his fingers through the shock of greasy black hair that hung down unevenly over his forehead, and moved over to the fire. "What's the hurry?" he protested. "I was just sleeping good." "We gotta hightail it back to Diablo and check in with the boss." His brother had helped himself to the contents of the frying pan, and spoke through a large mouthful of beans. "Maybe he's got another job for us, something bigger this time." Okay, but a man needs sleep. He ain't right unless he gets plenty of it." "You sleep 7/8 of the time, and you still ain't right," snorted the other. It was an old argument, carried on half-heartedly. Rufe and Rube Horton were really so much alike that neither actually found anything wrong about his twin. They just had to snarl at each other from time to time when there was no one else around to bully. "Wait till the boss hears you rid off with a case of eau de cologne water, thinking it was something worthwhile," his twin grunted. Then, "Anyhow, we got a couple of good watches in the hall, and more than 300 in greenbacks off them stage passengers." He sighed. "Wish we could keep it ourselves." "Well, we can't, so eat up and let's break camp and head back." They made short work of the scanty breakfast, and then Rufe lumbered to his feet and shuffled over toward the horses. "Don't take all day saddling up." Rube was dumping the remains of the dirty dishes. "It started to turn hot already." "Quit ordering me around." Rufe turned his head to bark back at his brother, and failed to notice one of the discarded blanket hoods lying on the ground in front of him. His feet tangled in it, and he started to fall forward. He saved himself by clutching the mane of the nearest horse. It happened to be his own much-abused animal. The poor creature had taken many a beating from the uneven-tempered man, and this seemed like the start of another. He snorted in fright and reared, pawing in the air wildly. Rufe swore angrily and jerked hard on the rope, half choking the horse as he tried to subdue him. The animal's foot came down on a loose stone that rolled beneath it and threw him off balance. In a frantic struggle to keep his footing, the horse gashed his right foreleg on a jagged rock. The pain of the injury threw him into a complete panic, and it took the combined efforts of the brothers to bring him under control. When he finally stood, shaking and quivering, they could see that the gash, while it looked bad, was not deep. He would be lame for a few days, and not much use for the kind of riding they usually had to do. "Blasted hard-luck critter! I ought to finish him off right now." Rufe clapped his hand to the butt of his heavy 6-shooter. "Forget it," his brother said sharply. "He'll be as good as new in a couple of days. Meanwhile, you better not try to ride him. We'll wrap up that leg and get him to the horse dock at Diablo." "Yeah, well, I ain't walking to oblige no mangy old cayuse." "You don't have to walk. My bucko will carry double." "You know blame well he'll bog down in half a mile, and if you think you can talk me—" He broke off suddenly to listen. "Wagon wheels." "Coming from Smoke Tree," Rube decided. "Might be the stage highballing it back to Diablo off schedule on account of some big bad bandits holding it up last night." "Yeah," Rufe nodded with a snaggletooth grin. "Maybe we ought to speed 'em on their way." He slapped the walnut handles of his tied-down 6-shooters suggestively. "Wait," Rube listened with a scowl. "Wheels are squeaking. Can't be the stage. I better take a look." He checked his 6-shooters quickly, then cautiously made his way between the boulders, keeping out of sight of the oncoming wagon. Now he could see what it was. His mouth twisted in a contemptuous sneer. Just a girl on a horse and a kid driving a rickety old farm wagon loaded with furniture. Pilgrims. Probably didn't have $1 between them. It would be a waste of time to try to rob them. He was moving back when he realized that Rufe had come up behind him and was staring past him at the pair. "Nothing to bother about there," Rube whispered. "Just shoestringers." But Rufe held his ground. He nodded toward the girl on the horse. "That's a likely-looking cow pony," he said. "Maybe I could trade her my old crowbait for him." Rube took another look. What are we waiting for? Take 'em. Reckon I will at that." The warm, still air was stirring a little now, and the smell of a wood fire came faintly to Annie's nose, mingling with the aroma of fried bacon. She was not really conscious of what it was. It just made her vaguely hungry and reminded her suddenly that she had rushed Tag away from the station without breakfast. The poor lamb. She reined in and waited for the wagon to catch up with her. Tag was sniffing the air. "I smell bacon," he announced. "Boy!" "I thought I did too," she admitted. She looked keenly about, but there was no sign of a campfire or a friendly prospector anywhere. "Guess it was just imagination and an empty tummy. We better stop right here and cure it." Tag was more than willing. He sawed on the reins and brought the mules to a stop. Annie swung off target and dropped the reins across his neck, letting them trail on the ground. She knew that he would stay there until she came back to him or called him to her. He nosed the sandy ground for a possible tuft of grass, but he didn't find anything promising, so he lowered his head and closed his eyes for a nap. Annie looked around for a good place to start the cooking fire. There was plenty of kindling in the wagon now, thanks to the obliging stablemen who had helped them on their way. She took an armful of short sticks and knelt to build up her fire in the shelter of a small rock. She went about it expertly, and with no suspicion that two pairs of beady black eyes were watching every move. Tag yawned and stretched as he jumped down off the wagon seat and went around behind the wagon to get out the breakfast things. Annie was bending to blow the sparks of her fire into flame. Her back was turned to Target, but she heard him snort, and she knew from the kind of sound he made that something was frightening him. Swift as a cat, she was on her feet in an instant, had swung around and leveled her Colt at the gray-hooded man who had a grip on Target's reins and was trying to drag the cow pony away with him. Target was braced against the pull, snorting and digging in with his 4 feet. "Let go," she called out, "or I'll shoot." "Don't talk foolish, miss." The thick-sounding voice came from over at the wagon. "Put away that gun before it goes off and hurts you. We know you're bluffing." Annie wheeled at the first word. A second gray-hooded man had caught Tag from behind and was using him as a shield. His left arm was tight across Tag's throat, and the boy's feet were off the ground. He was gasping for breath, feebly tearing at the arm that was choking him. The hooded man held a 6-shooter lightly in his other hand and gestured carelessly with it as he spoke. She thought fast. If she shot now and smashed the man's gun, the flying metal might cut Tag badly. She cast a quick glance over her shoulder toward Target. The gallant little pony was more than holding his own against the cursing man. Annie lowered her Colt and slipped it into the holster. "That's more like it." The man who was holding Tag let him drop. Tag fell limply and rolled over, clutching his throat and gasping. The man flourished his gun. "Now just do like we tell you." Annie's Colt flashed lightning swift from its holster again, and she aimed and fired in one motion. The long 6-shooter leaped out of the hooded man's hand and flew through the air in 100 pieces. He yelped in pain and nursed his hand. Tag scrambled away, and Annie wheeled on the man who was trying to subdue Target. Her quick shot clipped off the high heel of his boot. Thrown off balance, he toppled over backward and fell heavily. When he rolled over and tried to make a fast draw, Annie's third shot plowed into the sand 6 inches from his other boot. "Don't try it," she called. "Get your hands up." He glared at her through the eye holes of the hood, but his hands went up, high. "Keep them that way," she advised, gesturing with the Colt, "and stay where you are." "Look out, Annie!" It was Tag's yell. Annie whirled to see the other hooded man making a fast left-handed draw. Her bullet hit his revolver before it was out of his holster, and there was a deafening roar of a double explosion. She was ready for another shot, but Rube Horton had had enough. He dropped the smoking remains of his second gun and ran out of sight among the boulders. Annie turned toward the man on the ground, her gun still ready, but he was not looking for more trouble. He sat up with his hands over his head. "Pull off that hood," she ordered. Rube Horton hesitated only a second, then he slowly obeyed. Annie and Tag stared at the dirty, black-bearded face with its small, shiny, black animal eyes. His lips were drawn back in a defiant snarl, but he eyed the 6-gun in her hand with respect. "We didn't figure to do you any hurt, miss. We just wanted the hoss," he whined. Over among the boulders, Rube Horton was riding out, leading his twin's lame horse after him. Ruth turned to scowl after him. He muttered angrily under his breath. Even at that distance, Annie could see the rough bandage on the led horse's foreleg, and she guessed why the men had tried to steal Target. She knew from the evidence of the gray hoods that these were the men who had held up the stage last night. As she watched Rube disappear among the sandhills to the north, she was quite sure she would have no more trouble with him before she got to Diablo, and she made up her mind what she was going to do with this one. She was going to take him along and see what the law would do to him. She motioned him to get to his feet. The missing boot heel gave him a list to one side, like a man climbing around the side of a hill. "How far is it to Diablo from here?" Annie asked him. Ruth hesitated. This sunny-haired girl might be a good shot and one of the fastest draws he had ever met, but she was still only a woman. He decided to try for sympathy. 8 miles, ma'am," he whined. "A powerful long way in the hot sun. I hope you ain't fixin' to make me walk." Annie winked at Tag, who grinned back at her. "What do you say, Tag? It might slow us down a bit." "Sure would, Annie." "All right, then, we'll let him ride. Bring the lasso rope and we'll take Uncle Luke a new boarder for his jail." She had brought in her uncle's name deliberately to see what effect it would have on the prisoner. She hoped he would look worried. Instead, he yawned and let them tie him up and bundle him into the wagon without comment. Later, after Tag had eaten all the breakfast he wanted and they were ready to start for Diablo, Annie tried again. "We'll take along that hood," she told Tag, tucking it into the wagon beside the prisoner. "Uncle Luke will want to use it as evidence about last night." This time she saw a mocking look in the small animal eyes and a sneering smile twisting his lips. It was plain that the Diablo sheriff and his jail held no terrors for this particular road agent. For some reason he was not worried. Annie was disturbed. She tried to dismiss the sneer from her mind as she set the wagon in motion and mounted target for the last lap of their journey. But it didn't stay away. It came back during the rest of the long, hot ride to Diablo and tormented her with doubts. Why wasn't this hold-up man and horse thief afraid of her uncle's authority? Had that loud-talking salesman been right last night when he said that Luke McTavish closed his eyes to crime in his county? She would soon be in a position to find out. It seemed an endless ride to Annie, but at last she sighted the town she had traveled so far to reach. It was like 20 others they had passed through in the last 4 weeks since they had left the greener valleys of the eastern end of the trail. The life of the town flowed lazily through one dusty main street. Weathered frame buildings lined the street, and, except for the freshly painted land office, all had been there many years. Cow horses stood at the hitch racks, and booted, spurred men of the saddle trod the warped boards of the sidewalks. Down at one end of the street, the sheriff's adobe office and jail stood apart. As Annie led the way through the dusty street toward the jail, the black-bearded prisoner in her wagon leaned forward and stared at the gold-lettered window of the neat land office. "John Shanley, Land and Mining Agent," the shiny letters read. A face appeared suddenly at the window, Rube Horton's face. The prisoner's eyes met his, and Rube made a quick sign of reassurance before he disappeared again into the shadows of the office. In the wagon, Ruth gave a contented sigh and settled back. Everything was under control. The wagon creaked on its way. In the land office, the fashionably dressed, handsome, middle-aged man behind the big roll-top desk looked at Rube Horton disgustedly. "You and your precious brother are more trouble than you're worth, Horton. I told you to make that stage hold-up last night a quick job, and then duck. By now you should be miles away. Instead, you ride in here or leave those 2 crowbait nags of yours in my alley for anybody who was on that stage to recognize, and that brother of yours gets himself tied up by a greenhorn girl and a little boy." Rube scowled. "Nobody'll know our horses, and if you ever saw that settler gal out there handle a 6-gun, you wouldn't be so uppity about her. Oh, get out of here." Wealthy John Shanley pulled a half a dozen coins from his well-filled purse and scattered them across the desk at Rube. "Here's your pay, in good Denver coin. Now get out of town and stay out till I send for you again." "What happens to Rufe?" The black-bearded twin was hungrily gathering up the gold coins. "They got him dead to rights on that horse stealing." "I'll look after him." John Shanley waved him away. "Now go, and don't try any more jobs that I don't order. I'll let you know when I need you again." Shanley watched Rube Horton leave by the back door. Then he locked it securely and went back to his high-topped desk. He settled in at the deep leather chair and selected a slender Havana cigar from his silver-trimmed humidor. Those cigars cost him almost as much as the food for his whole stylish establishment at the other end of town, he reflected, but they were well worth it. They were his trademark. He was the only man in town who could afford such extravagance, and it stamped him as a leader. He had clinched many a sale of a mining claim or a doubtful lot far out on the desert with the gift of one of those expensive cigars. He smiled at his own shrewdness, but the smile disappeared as he took out a map of Diablo that he kept locked in the small drawer labeled Private. Each lot on the main street was marked. some initialed J.S., others with different initials. He studied the map with a frown. There were still too many other initials on business lots that he wanted, but there was no doubt in his mind that he would change that before too long. The thing that made him frown was the string of neatly plotted lots that extended from the north edge of town out toward the hills. They were all marked with size and number, a number that corresponded with certain records in his ledger. They were all sold, those lots, sold to people who had never seen them. Yet. That was the rub. He had sold them by advertisement in the big Boston papers to people who believed what they read and who wanted to make their homes in the rich new country they had heard so much about, where gold and silver were lying in the streets to be picked up by anyone. And with the coming of fall, most of those eager buyers would be coming to claim the land they had bought. John Shanley had to be ready to deliver legal title to it. The only thing that stood in the way of this happy ending was that Shanley had sold many thousands of dollars worth of property that he had no right to sell. It belonged to someone else. Across the map, just a short distance beyond the edge of the town itself, ran a firm black line that cut through the neatly drawn and numbered lots. It was a boundary line, the southern boundary of a ranch. It wasn't a very large ranch, as ranches go, only 160 acres, practically no land at all in that country of great distances. But it stood in John Shanley's way, and it was a threat to him and the rich future he planned. Because if John Shanley could not wipe out those boundaries before his customers came flocking out to claim their land, he might end up in jail, not only disgraced and branded a crook, but cheated out of his political ambitions forever. A man who hoped to be governor one day, when the territory gained its statehood, had to have a clean record. He was not especially worried at the moment. He had made a fair offer to the owner of the little ranch. True, it had been refused, much to Shanley's surprise and annoyance. He had had no idea he would be delayed by a refusal. He had offered a larger price than the land was worth, just to make sure there would be no delay. And then the stubborn old fool said, "No, I've decided not to sell. I've got other plans." And he had stuck with that decision and been strangely mysterious about those plans. "Can't sell to anybody now," he had chuckled. "I need that ranch." Shanley had tried several times to change his mind, but the answer was always no. So Shanley had made other plans, and he had been going ahead with them very successfully so far. When he was finished with stubborn old Luke McTavish, there would be a new sheriff in Diablo, and Luke would be in such disgrace that he would be glad to sell out and leave the town forever. Shanley's campaign was costing him a lot of gold pieces, but it was worth it, with his whole future hanging in the balance. At first he had felt a touch of regret. Luke had been a good friend, and no one knew better than Shanley that the sheriff was honest and trustworthy. But John Shanley had to have that ranch, and quickly. That was all that mattered now. Up at the end of the street in front of the jail, Annie dismounted and looped Target's reins around the hitch rail. Tag brought up the wagon, and Annie tied the mules before she went around to get the prisoner. A group of men had gathered quietly to watch. Annie's eyes swept them quickly. They seemed to be only mildly interested. They stared, but no one asked any questions, and no one offered to give her a hand with the prisoner. She helped him out of the wagon, and he stood lopsidedly waiting. She had a curious feeling that these citizens of Diablo were taking a hands-off attitude. A bold-looking man in a Stetson was nearest. She asked him, "Is the sheriff in? I have a prisoner for him." "Now that's real obliging of you, miss," he answered loudly. Annie could tell it was meant for the crowd to hear. "He sure don't bring in any himself these days." "What'd you expect?" came a taunting voice from the edge of the crowd. Annie's eyes flashed in that direction, but she couldn't distinguish the speaker. There were several men snickering, and there were several others who were scowling. She felt the same uneasiness that had kept her awake all night. Something was wrong when people laughed like that at hearing their sheriff belittled. She nudged the prisoner ahead of her toward the sheriff's office. The door was standing open. She would soon know what kind of a man her mother's brother had become. And that is the end of Chapter 4.